Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I hope you're all doing great and enjoying the master classes for the Athena Hackathon. Now, 30,000. Does anyone have an idea what that number stands for? That is the number of websites hacked every day globally, according to the TechJury website. With that grounding reality to start us off, let me introduce you to the topic of this masterclass. In a world that's fraught with fraud and risk, keeping access to critical data and infrastructure secure and easy is a very important goal. So in today's talk, Saloni, Pamela, and myself will walk you through the topic passwordless authentication and how we got there. That's the crew. We'll start off with some introductions. I'm Zeba. I'm an engineering manager, currently working with Visa at the Innovation Center in London. I have around 15 years of IT experience, 5 years at Visa, 10 years prior to that with eBay. But when I started my career, I did not start as a software engineer. I was a trained civil engineer, later making the jump into software engineering and pocketing a part-time master's in computer science along the way. That's me. I'll pass on to Pamela for her intro.
Hi everyone, my name is Pamela and I'm a senior software engineer at Visa's Innovation Center. Just a little background about myself. So I got an integrated master's in software engineering at Queen's University Belfast. I've been working in the industry now for 5 years, first with CyberSource, then afterwards I joined Visa, and I look forward to meeting you all at the weekend, so I'll pass you on to Saloni.
Hi, my name is Saloni. I'm a staff software engineer at Visa's Innovation Center. I have a master's from Syracuse University in computer engineering, and I have 6 years of work experience in the industry.
As you might have noticed, all three of us work with Visa's Innovation Center in London. We're a fun team. We do a bunch of cool work around new payment flows, value-added services, data. While most of this talk is around specific technologies, we do spend the last part of the session talking specifically around authentication in payments. If you do find any of this interesting, do connect with us on LinkedIn and drop a hi. We also have several positions open in our team. So if you're a passionate software engineer looking for some good challenges, we'd love to have you on in the team. Before we delve into the rest of the session, just to let you know, parts of the session are pre-recorded, but we are very much around and monitoring the chat as well. Do drop us any questions if you have, and we're happy to answer them either during the session or as a follow-up in chat or in person over the hackathon. First, a standard disclaimer. This basically tells you that the content of this presentation is purely informational. You are encouraged to seek the advice of competent professionals where required. Moving on to our agenda for the day. The purpose of computer systems security is to help us achieve our business goals even in the presence of adversaries. Authentication systems and hackers are getting smarter every day, and this is a fast evolving space. So for a software engineer, this is a three-cornered fight, where the primary goal is to achieve business objectives, but it has to be done while protecting ourselves from adversaries and keeping user experience simple at the same time. So today we're going to look at some of the evolving authentication methods with a special focus on topics like Web Authn, which is our second section, followed by a look at the authentications in the payment space, including things like the secure customer authentication guidelines and tokenization. For Web Authn, we'll cover some code samples showing you how you can implement it yourself. But before we go there, let's look at the evolution of thought in the space of authentication. So how basic authentication systems look like, how flaws have been exploited by adversaries, and how we got to where we are. So this will set us up in the right frame of mind to understand what are the standards in place today to keep your identities and your payments secure. Passing on to Pamela.
Sure. So what we're going to start off with is the evolution of authentication. So first we'll take a look at access control basics. Access control basically comprises three pillars. The first pillar is the identity establishment or user registration. This is where the user registers in a system and makes statements about how they may be identified. For example, in a traditional setup, you might walk into a bank and provide the bank with photographic identification. This would be what the bank may use later on to verify you if you walk into the branch again. In a more modern setting, this is the username and password that you register with when you sign up to a website. The second pillar is authentication. When a returning user comes back to your system and wants to use capabilities exposed by your system, you need to first validate that they are who they claim to be. This proving of ownership of your identity is the process of authentication. Example, if you registered the username or password in the first step, you can authenticate by supplying it again to the website to prove this is your account. Finally, authorization. Once the system has established that you are who you claim to be, it needs to set boundaries on what privileges you have on the system. For example, an admin would have different levels of access in comparison to a regular user. There is a fourth pillar, which is auditing. All identity establishment, authentication, and authorization events should be logged and subjected to regular audit. For this session, we are only bothered about the first two pillars, the establishment and proving of identity, though we will briefly reference authorization. We'll be taking you through some of the major milestones and advancements authentication has taken since the humble password came on the scene in 1961. First, we'll begin with the password, something we are all very familiar with and enter in multiple times a day. Can you believe there was a time when passwords never existed? In the older days, computer use was reserved for scientists, researchers, and the government. There wasn't much of a need for user profiles or authentication. In the 1960s, computer use was becoming more available to the public. As you can imagine, being on a computer that allows you access to everyone else's files was pretty chaotic. In 1961, a researcher in MIT called Fernando Carbado, known as the father of the password, noticed this issue and came up with a rudimentary password program. The system prompted the user for a password and then saved it into a plain text file within the file system. On login, the user had access to their own files for 4 hours. I wonder what could go wrong with this solution. One file on a computer with all user passwords in plain text? It wouldn't take long to find out. In 1961, one of the first known data breaches happened. A PhD student got access to the master file, printed out the passwords, and passed them around users. Overall passwords were a step in the right direction, but if a user obtained the master file, they had access to all the passwords. Definitely not good. As mentioned, passwords would be the most used authentication method we use every day, but how well do you really know them? Here's some interesting facts about passwords. So we all know we should make our passwords hard to guess. What could the most common password in 2022 be? It's simply 123456. Some other examples are QWERTY and even password. What % of users use the same password for multiple accounts? We all should have different passwords for each account we use to reduce the impact if our password was compromised. Too bad only 28% of us follow this practice. How long does a password have to be safe from brute force attackers? Well, the number is now 13. Does the length of the password matter as long as I use symbols and numbers to make it more complex? Unfortunately not. A brute force attack with tools that quickly try all possible combinations of keys until they get it right might easily crack them, as the shorter the password, the smaller the number of possible combinations. This type of attack was at the center of the infamous iCloud breach that exposed hundreds of celebrities' personal photos. And finally, what percentage of hacking-related breaches are linked to passwords? Well, a whopping 80%. Who knew that passwords were so risky? To close off on passwords, I'll reiterate the importance of both complexity and length to keep your password safe. Think of the current password you use regularly. Is it in the green? You'll notice that an 11-character password of just lowercase letters takes 1 day to brute force. Increase that to 13 and it takes a year. Crazy how much difference 2 letters can make. I guess you can see now why on user registrations you get prompted with more rules your passwords need to comply with these days. As we discussed, storing passwords in plain text was not a good idea. How else could we store them? This is where hashing comes in. We pass in a string, such as a password, into a mathematical function that produces a new fixed-length string of characters. This function only works one way, making it almost impossible to determine the original password. There are a variety of hashing algorithms that can be used, such as MD5 and SHA-256. On login, to check your password, it is hashed, then compared to the hashed value in the database. The example above shows the hashed value of Cross-Tower using SHA-256. A method called salting can be used to make this more secure, which involves appending a random string called a salt to the password before hashing. The salt is stored along with the hash result. This method means that users that have the same passwords will have different hash values. The main advantage, as mentioned, is hashes work one way, so the original password cannot be derived from it, though the disadvantage is this doesn't stop a hacker brute forcing the password if they know the hashing algorithm used and sufficient salting wasn't performed. Moving on to the 1970s. We now have passwords hashed, so what's next? Well, encryption. Asymmetric cryptography was created in 1973, starting with the RSA encryption algorithm. The great thing about encryption is while hashing is good, it only works one way. I can't determine the original value with the hash. What if I wanted to protect data such as names or maybe phone numbers? Using encryption, we can get the original value back again with the right keys. This process uses a pair of related keys, one public key and one private key. To send an encrypted message, you pull the intended recipient's public key from a public directory and use it to encrypt the message before sending it. The recipient of the message can then decrypt the message using their related private key. If the sender encrypts the message using their private key, the message can be decrypted only using that sender's public key, thus authenticating the sender. This all sounds great, doesn't it? Unfortunately, this technology won't be released for public use until 1997. We'll talk more about that later. Moving into the mid-1980s, passwords have taken on a new form. As technology quickly advanced, the failability of passwords became more and more obvious. As we've seen, if the password selected isn't long and complex, it's in danger of being stolen or even brute forced. We have to depend on users to pick strong passwords and not reuse them to keep them safe. Passwords are only as safe as the user creates them, unfortunately, and by human nature, we like to keep passwords quick to type in and easy to remember, definitely not secure. The idea to use dynamic passwords came in as this helps remove human nature from the equation. This is the first time we will enter passwordless territory. The user would no longer select a password of their own. They would be given a fob that would generate a one-time use password to log in. 2 protocols were created to generate these passcodes. Time-based OTP, where the uniqueness of the OTP is generated based on the current time. HMAC-based OTP, where the uniqueness of the OTP is generated based on the hash of the previous password. HOTP is used in Oauth today. We'll touch on this later. While OTPs helped fight the hackers, they still aren't perfect. The advantages are it protects against replay attacks, as the codes can only be used once, and a fob is a simple device to generate passwords. The disadvantages are if you lost your fob, you could no longer generate passwords and would get locked out of your account. Your fob could get stolen and used by a malicious user. Unsurprisingly, it's also susceptible to phishing attacks. An attacker could create a fake website like the Authentication portal, or trick you via email or even phone to give out your OTP. Now we've arrived in the 1990s. So remember we spoke about asymmetric encryption and how it was great, but it was kept a secret? Well, finally in 1997, it was released to the public to utilise. Just a reminder, this is the process of encrypting a message using two keys. By the 1990s, the internet was becoming widely used by the public. Many companies had started to create web pages. With so much sensitive data online, strong authentication was needed to make sure only correct users were accessing their information. While asymmetric encryption is very powerful, they decided to standardise the process to make it easier and safer for the public to use. What would happen if we got a public key or certificate given to us that didn't belong to who we thought it did? For example, a malicious website imitating an online store. PKI is a framework for managing digital certificates and encryption keys that addresses this issue. During this process, TLS, Transport Layer Security Protocol, and SSL, Secure Sockets Layer Protocol, which includes keys and server authentication, were developed. Let's look a little further at how it works. We'll briefly walk through the process. I've created a new website and I'd like users to communicate on my website with a secure connection. First, I'd prove my identity to the registration authority and tell them I'd like a certificate for my website. The registration authority approves and my request is passed on to the certificate authority. The certificate authority then issues me a certificate. The public certificate is the central directory. Next, when a user connects to my website, it will send along my public certificate. The user then calls out to the verification authority to check if the certificate they received matches up with what was issued by the certificate authority, proving my identity. If I send a message signed with my private certificate, similarly, the user checks the signature with the verification authority to verify the message has come from me. Briefly, I'll discuss how using PKI, users can agree on a symmetric key without exchanging sensitive information, allowing them to communicate with a secure connection. The process works by two peers exchanging their public keys. In this example, we'll call them Bob and Alice. Bob would send his public key to Alice, and Alice would send her public key to Bob. Bob would then use the public key sent from Alice on his own private key to generate a symmetric key using the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. Alice would also take up the same process as Bob, and in turn produce the exact same symmetric key as Bob, enabling them to communicate securely over the insecure internet. Both peers can now encrypt, transmit, and decrypt data using their symmetric keys. Finally, we'll take a quick look at advantages and disadvantages. With digital signatures, users are sure they're communicating with the correct website and not a fake malicious one. Sending information is now secure using SSL. Users who wish to communicate with one another securely do not have to exchange secret keys, passwords, or anything else that would otherwise be needed for decrypting a message, keeping those secrets safe. The disadvantages, though, are the network overhead involved with PKI is considerable when compared to other security solutions. And certificate revocation lists must be maintained in order to properly keep track of valid and invalid certificates. Security administrators must have a way to stay current with who is and who isn't authorized to access the network, using up resources. We're now going to take a couple of steps back now to really look at how we have been attempting to authenticate users. Every type of authentication we've tried so far pretty much falls into two categories: something that you know or something that you possess. There is also a third factor, the inherence factor, something that you are, which we will talk more on in a bit. These are the three main factors. In addition, there are also a few other factors that are sometimes considered. Something that you process, somewhere that you are, somebody that you know. In essence, the first three are the main factors, and the others may typically be added on for extra security or for specific flows. So now we've arrived in the 2000s. Multi-factor authentication requires an individual to provide two separate and independent forms of authentication before access is granted. Let's look at each of these independently. So as mentioned before, there's things that you know. The examples are passwords and PIN numbers. The swipe path used on Android could possibly be considered one as well, but it's not accepted as a valid authentication method for payments. Then there's things that you have. When you establish your TLS connection, you are establishing possession of the keys. SMS OTPs, they show proof of possession of your SIM card. Email OTPs, well, these are tricky ones. It could be a proof that you know your email provider's password, though in some cases, if someone gained access to your laptop or phone, they pretty much could have access to all your emails and hence your OTPs without needing to know your password. TOTPs are proof of possession of the device. Then finally, there's things that you are. These are essentially inherent factors. The availability of smartphones possessing biometric capabilities, such as Face ID and fingerprint scanning, has made this a popular and easy way to use this factor of authentication. We'll look at this in more detail shortly. Then one final important part of multi-factor authentication is that each factor has to be independent of each other. So for example, if you sign up to a website with a username and password, which would be your knowledge factor, plus an OTP to an email account, which is your possession factor, and if your website password and email account password are the same, then they aren't two independent factors, unfortunately, and couldn't be used for multi-factor authentication. So, requiring multiple kinds of authentication prevents a malicious user from accessing your account, as they may have one piece of data from you, like your password, but they may not have the others required to log in, for example, your OTP. So the advantages are it stops risk of access via breached passwords, keeps information in lost devices secure, but the disadvantages are users could get locked out of their account if they don't have access to their second authentication method. For example, if your phone had no signal and you need an SMS OTP. The process can be cumbersome and slow, as you have to authenticate in multiple ways. And finally, it relies on third-party companies to send you things such as SMS or emails or notifications.
So we've tried to keep the presentation pretty lightweight and at a conceptual level. But each of the authentication methods we've spoken about, and especially any aspect involving cryptography, is pretty complex, and it's very easy to get wrong. In fact, I'm sure we've probably made a couple of mistakes just in this presentation, which is why the industry quickly realized that it makes sense to standardize and consolidate authentication and authorization servers into a single place, use them for the whole organization rather than have every individual application developer come up with their own buggy implementation of it. It also makes it simple, consistent, easy to scale, and also to manage. So with this comes in single sign-on, that's SSO, Oauth, OIDC, SAML, and the lot. These are not really authentication methods, but frameworks and patterns for authentication and authorization. Single sign-on lets users securely authenticate with multiple applications and websites by using just one set of credentials. Oauth and Oauth 2.0 are frameworks for access delegation. You would be familiar with how Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. permit you to use their login and share limited account information with other third-party applications and sites. So while Oauth deals mostly with authorization, OIDC provides an identity protocol, and it's an open standard that's built using Oauth 2.0. As more and more identity providers have come into the market, now the users may want to use one or more of the identity providers for controlling access to their applications. And this is where identity brokers and federated identity management then come in. So while we're not going into the details of any of these, in real life authentication and authorization implementations, you would typically run into one of these.
Security is complex. Over the decades since the first password-based authentication, computer system security has stepped up to the challenges posed by hackers and adversaries. However, the downside of the whole game was that the user experience could become very poor. For example, a multi-factor authentication, especially if they are federated over multiple providers, can easily become cumbersome for users. With smartphones becoming almost ubiquitous today and inherent factors within the easy reach of users, it has become possible to attain both security and good user experience. Let's have a brief look at the various inherent factors and also what all could comprise the so-called passwordless flows. Biometrics uses biological traits, such as fingerprint or face shapes, to authenticate users. This is largely used on mobile devices. Websites can also use this via Web Author. These are some of the technologies that can be used to digitally identify people or grant them permission to access the system. Here's a quick look at comparison of existing passwordless techniques with pros and cons. Let's take a closer look at device binding. Device binding is the process of establishing a strong trust between a device and a backend server through mechanisms such as ECDH protocol. The ECDH is a key agreement protocol that allows two parties, say a mobile device and a backend server, each having an elliptic curve public-private key pair, to establish a shared secret over an insecure channel. This is somewhat like establishing a two-way SSL, and as a result, helps in authoritatively identifying a device so that it can be used as a possession factor. Now that we know the pros and cons of different authentication techniques, it is time to look at Web Author, which provides solution to most of the security and standardization issues while making authentication convenient for users. W3C Web Author defines a standard web API that is being built into browsers and platforms to enable support for Fido authentication. Let's take a quick look at Fido to understand Web Author better. Fido stands for Fast Identity Online. For implementing authentication beyond a password and perhaps an OTP, companies have traditionally been faced with an entire stack of proprietary clients and protocols. Fido changes this by standardizing the client and protocol layers. This ignites a thriving ecosystem of client authentication methods such as biometrics, PINs, and second factors that can then be used with a variety of online services in an interoperable manner. Web Author is part of the Fido Alliance's Fido 2 specifications. Let's take a quick look at Fido 2. Fido 2 is comprised of the W3C Web Authentication specification and corresponding client to authenticator protocols known as CTAP from the Fido Alliance. Fido 2 supports passwordless, second factor, and multi-factor user experiences with embedded authenticators such as biometrics or PINs, or external authenticators such as Fido security keys, mobile devices, wearables, etc. CTAP is a protocol that enables an external authenticator such as a security key or a mobile phone to work with browsers that support Web Author, and also to serve as an authenticator to desktop applications and web services. There are three essential concepts behind Web Authentication. A hardware security model stores the private keys and performs cryptographic operations for authentication. A key pair only works for a specific origin, thus preventing phishing. Authenticators provide a certificate that helps servers identify and confirm the source of the public key. As far as authenticators are concerned, we can identify two main categories: platform authenticators built into the device, and roaming authenticators, an external device that can connect to other platforms. In WebAuthn, the relying party corresponds to the application that will ask for the user to interact with the authenticator. Let's take a quick look at the demo to see how WebAuthn works. This flow goes over user registration and authentication. User starts registering by entering username and clicking register button. The client browser requests registration challenge from relying party server. Relying party requests the authenticator to create new credentials. Authenticator requires the user to verify their identity. On verification, new key pair is generated and the public key as well as attested object is sent back to relying party, which stores the credential under a new name. During authentication, the relying party sends challenge to browser. The authenticator again requires user to verify the identity to retrieve the private key from secure storage and sends a signed challenge to the browser. Browser sends this challenge to relying party and relying party validates it. That's how the login is successful. Today we'll take a look at some code samples provided by Google for getting started with WebAuthn. We will limit ourselves to account registration and authentication. We won't be dwelling much on adding or removing credentials, account recovery, and Fido server implementation. In WebAuthn, a server must provide data that binds a user to a credential. This data includes identifiers for the user and organization, also known as the relying party. The website would then use the Web Authentication API to prompt the user to create a new key pair. It is important to note that we need a randomly generated string from the server as a challenge to prevent replay attacks. As we can see, once the user indicates intent to create account, relying party server sends a request containing challenge, user info, and relying party info to the browser or client. Client relays this information to the authenticator, which in turn generates a new key pair for the current user and relying party and sends back attestation, public key, and credential ID to the client. Client sends this information to the relying party server, which validates the data and stores the data by creating a new account for the user. Here we have created a register credential function, which registers a new credential. Before we ask the user to register a new credential, we need to request that the server return parameters to pass in WebAuthn, including a challenge. In the payload to server, we pass attestation. This option allows servers to indicate how important the attestation data is to the registration event. The value can be none, indirect, or direct. Next, we pass the authenticator selection object. It contains authenticator attachment, which is used to specify if authenticator used will be platform or cross-platform. Then we specify user verification from local user as required. And finally, require resident key, which is optional. Use true if the created credential should be available for future account picker UX. We can also pass an array of public key credential descriptor to prevent authenticator from creating duplicate ones. This is passed as exclude credentials. In the next slide, we will go through the options that you receive from the server on making the call /auth/register request. RP here stands for relying party. ID returned must be subset of the domain currently in the browser. Then comes the user object with info about user. The challenge is a buffer of cryptographically random bytes generated on the server and is needed to prevent replay attacks. Public key credential params. This is an array of objects describing what public key types are acceptable to a server. We have already seen the authenticator selection and attestation on previous slide. Timeout is the time in milliseconds that the user has to respond to a prompt for registration before an error is returned. Because these options are delivered encoded through HTTP protocol, we need to convert some parameters back to binary. Once we receive the options from server containing challenge and RP info from server, we make the call to navigator.credentials.create method to create a new credential. With this call, the browser interacts with the authenticator and tries to verify the user's identity. Once the user verifies the identity, we should receive a credential object that we can send to the server and register with the authenticator. Here too, we need to encode the binary parameters of the credential so that it can be delivered to the server as a string. In the payload, we have ID, which is the newly generated credential. It will be used to identify the credential when authenticating the user. This is provided as a base 64 encoded string. Raw ID is the same ID but in binary form. Client data JSON represents data passed from the browser to authenticator in order to associate the new credential with the server and browser. Attestation object contains credential public key, an optional attestation certificate, and other metadata used to validate the registration event. We have stored the credential ID locally so that we can use it for authentication when the user comes back. And finally, we send the object to the server, and if it returns HTTP code 200, consider the new credential as successfully registered. Now that we have registered our user, let's move on to see how Web Authn client-side authentication can be implemented. When the user's client or browser indicates its intention to authenticate a user, the server sends a challenge to the client. The client relays this challenge along with relying party ID to the authenticator. Authenticator prompts for user verification, and once user is verified, it creates an assertion by signing the challenge with private key stored in secure storage on the user's device. This data is then sent to client, which passes it on to relying party server. The server computes its own version of attestation signature with the public key that is stored at registration time and compares the result against the signature that the browser presented. Once validation is successful, user can access their account. We have created a function called authenticate, which verifies the user's identity with a fingerprint. Before authentication, we examine if the user has stored credential ID and set it as a query parameter if they do. When we provide a credential ID along with other options, the server can provide relevant allow credentials, and this makes user verification reliable. We will ask the server to send back a challenge and other parameters using the call to /auth sign-in request for the specified credential ID. Let's take a look at the options we receive from server in response. We have the challenge, just like during registration. Allow credentials, which is an array which tells the browser which credentials the server would like the user to authenticate with. The credential ID retrieved and saved during registration is passed in here. The server can optionally indicate what transport it prefers, like USB, NFC, and Bluetooth. Timeout, same as during registration, is used to indicate the time in milliseconds that the user has to respond to a prompt for authentication. This field is optional. The most important option here is allow credentials. When we receive options from the server, allow credentials should either be a single object in an array or an empty array, depending on whether a credential with the ID in the query parameter is found on the server side. Also, since these options are delivered encoded in order to go through HTTP protocol, we need to convert some parameters back to binary. We will now call the navigator.credentials.get method to verify the user's identity using authenticator. Let's go over the public key credential object received in response. Here, ID stands for the credential identifier that was used to generate the authentication assertion. Raw ID is the same identifier but in binary form. Authenticator data is similar to auth data received during registration, with the notable exception that public key is not included here. Client data JSON is same as during registration. It's the collection of data passed from browser to authenticator. Signature is generated by the private key associated with this credential. On the server, the public key will be used to verify that this signature is valid. User handle is optional and provided by authenticator. It represents the user.id that was supplied during registration. Here we are creating the credential to be sent to server for authentication. We will again need to encode the binary parameters of the credential so that it can be delivered to the server as a string. If the server returns HTTP code 200, that means the user is successfully signed in. With this, we have completed user authentication using Web Authentication. To summarize, we have now seen that Web Authentication as an authentication method provides security, convenience, privacy, and scalability.
We've so far looked at authentication as a general concept, largely associated with identities. In this section, we'll focus a bit on the authentication of payments. So a bit of recap on the access control basics that we've seen earlier. So this is basically a three-step process. First, you have the identity creation and verification. With specific reference to payments, this is where you probably reach out to a bank, either in person or over the internet, request for an account to be opened. The bank typically takes you through a KYC or a Know Your Customer process, which is basically to establish with some level of confidence that you are who you claim to be. So this would involve either some established government identity proofs and also like a liveness check, either through your physical presence or something like a live video stream or some sort of biometric. Now that sets up your identity. Once the identity is established, you typically don't need to re-verify yourself with such a rigorous check every single time that you need to access the resources. You can establish factors of authentication that you can then use for making payments or for accessing your payment data. So we'll shortly look at what some of these authentication methods are in more detail. One case where you may need to re-verify yourself would be, for example, if you lose the factors of authentication, like forgetting your password or losing your mobile device. Talking about authorization, now this talk isn't about payment authorization, but for the sake of the bigger picture, I'll go into a brief discussion about payment authorization as well before going back and double-clicking into authentication. So just to look at the different parties involved in a typical payment transaction. First, you have the merchant, who's obviously selling the item to you. You have the merchant's bank, where the merchant expects to receive the money. We call this bank as the acquiring bank or the acquirer because they acquire the payment from you. We have your bank, which expects to part with your money. This bank is called the issuing bank or the issuer because they issue your card for you. And then, of course, we have you, the card holder or the user in this case. So I'll not go into the actual process of authorization as that's a topic of its own. But for our purpose, your identity was created with the issuer. So it's your issuer which will help authenticate you when you make your transaction. So this is going to be either through your passwords or through your banking app, or in some cases, this function might just get delegated by the issuer to the merchant, though that does imply a shift in the liability as well. So finally, it's the issuer again that's going to authorize your payment. So in this authorization step, they'll validate that your account is valid, you have enough funds, and then they'll block the funds in your account, even though actual money movement may not actually take place at that stage. So that covers the overall process. Let's talk about payment cards, which are obviously one of the authentication methods. So irrespective of whether they are credit, debit, prepaid, etc., typically these are three common types that you would see. The very first technology is the magnetic stripe. The black stripe that you see at the back of your payment card is actually like a magnetic tape. So when you swipe your card into a card reader or at an ATM, it's the magnetic head which detects the magnetic field generated by the stripe. And what sort of information do you think this contains? You typically find your card number, the name, expiry date, CVV, potentially some other data. So in this case, the card is just a data store. The terminal just reads the data, and the rest of the processing is done in the terminal. So all of the rules that apply for the authentication are just whatever is available at the terminal or the POS or the ATM. As you can imagine, this means that if your card is lost or stolen, the thief can just abuse your card as all the information is just available in there. Plus, they can just skim your card to get the details as they're not encrypted. So this brings us to the next generation of cards, the chip and pin. So these are more secure. They actually contain a circuit and can communicate with the card reader. So what you have is not just a data store, but also a processor or a mini computer. The readers capable of handling chip and pin can enforce the rules that the issuer have coded into the card. So this could be enforcing either online or offline authentication, PIN verification, verifying the limits, etc. It's up to the issuing bank now to define what sort of rules it wants against each individual type of card. So if offline verification happens, the authentication is actually being done on the card itself by the chip. In the case of online verification, the data is sent to the issuer backend, and that is verified there. The transaction details in this case are digitally signed by a transaction certificate, and this helps the issuer backend to verify the integrity of the data and also that the chip is not a counterfeit one. Then we also have the contactless cards. With contactless, the process is similar to chip and pin. The major difference between an EMV contactless chip transaction and an EMV contact chip transaction is that some of the transaction steps will be performed after the payment card or device has left the proximity of the reader, for example, in the case of online authorization. Besides these three, there's obviously various different variations of these, such as the presence of dynamic CVVs, etc. But for today, we're just going to gloss over all of that. So that's payment cards. So chip and pin contactless technologies provide the required protection for card-present transactions. But today, payments can happen in many different ways. And payment companies want to be able to support secure, convenient, and quick payment authentications, irrespective of where you are and what your payment moment is. Talking about EMV3DS, this is a messaging protocol that promotes frictionless consumer authentication and enables consumers to authenticate themselves with their card issuer while making card-not-present e-commerce purchases. As we've established before, your payment identity is registered with your bank, the issuer. So when you're making an online payment, it is your bank that is responsible for the payment authentication. The 3DS process looks like this. The consumer uses a payment card to make an online purchase on a mobile phone, tablet, laptop, or other device. To confirm that the consumer making the purchase is the actual card holder, the merchant uses EMV3DS for authentication. This involves sending data about the transaction, the payment method, and device information back to the issuer. So issuer now is the entity with whom you've registered your identity, reviews the data, and decides the type of authentication needed. In the UK and Europe, secure customer authentication requirements basically mean that issuers have to authenticate the payments using two factors of authentication. This includes OTPs, possibly Web Authn-based authentication, biometrics, knowledge-based questions, or any other methods. Sometimes, through contractual agreements, the issuers may delegate the authentication to the actual merchant. This does, however, transfer the liability of fraudulent transactions from the issuer to the merchant, but it provides a merchant with more control over the authentication process. That gives the potential to make it more seamless given the wider checkout context that is available to the merchant. Now, besides browsers and apps, there are other form factors through which a payment may occur, and these are shown here. In addition, digital wallets can also be used for payments. These can be device-based wallets, such as Google Pay or Apple Pay. And these store tokenized PAN on the user's own device. Besides this, there's also the e-com wallets that store tokenized PANs on their backend servers. Now, what is tokenization? Let's look at how it would work for a typical device that has the ability to store data securely, such as through a secure element, which would be the case with Apple Pay, or it could be with what is known as host card emulator, which would be the case with Android. So there are nuances that are different for each form factor, but and also depending on whether the payments are in store or online, but the mechanisms are somewhat similar at a high level. So at a high level, say it is Google Pay. When a Google Pay user adds a credit or a debit card to their Google Pay app, Google Pay sends ID and V and tokenization requests to the tokenization services hosted by Visa, MasterCard, etc. The ID and V is an identity verification request that is obviously sent to the issuer who owns your identity. And this verification is something that the issuer performs. The tokenization step then tokenizes the actual PAN into a token, meaning that you now have a desensitized, unique identification number associated with your PAN. Google Pay would then encrypt the newly tokenized card, store it securely, and it is then ready to be used for payments. To make a purchase, the customer taps their mobile device on a point of sale terminal or chooses to pay it in their mobile app. The possession of the securely stored tokenized PAN released by presenting the user's biometric is used to fully authenticate the user. And the successful authentication is represented by a cryptogram, which is like a single-use password. When the customer taps their mobile device, Google Pay responds with the customer's tokenized card and the cryptogram. The rest of the authorization process then continues as usual. Now, what are the benefits of tokenization? As you would have noticed, the PAN is no longer in scope, so it helps to keep the merchant outside of PCI scope. It also results in increased security because the tokens are limited use and they're tied to specific devices. They can also be revoked. In addition, it also improves the customer experience because possession factors can now be combined with biometric to allow payment with just a single gesture. So that's all about tokenization and how it helps with simplifying payment authentication. There are other payment authentications in place as well, depending upon what type of payment mechanism or what type of use case you're talking about. There could be peer-to-peer payments either through wallets or through crypto. There are government-to-consumer use cases that have picked up recently, especially in the post-pandemic world. But all of these are topics of their own, especially crypto, and we want to specifically keep them outside the scope of this talk. But they're referenced here just for completeness. I hope we've been able to give a good overview of authentication methods as well as a deep dive into Web Authn, and then also look at how payment authentications can take place. It's been nice being with you and presenting this. Thanks for joining us. We're still around and we'll try to answer any questions posted in the chat either right now or over the next few days. Do also feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or in person during the hackathon. Thank you.